December 10, 2001. When renowned 57-year-old scientist Robert Schwartz fails to show up to work at the Center for Innovative Technology in Herndon, Virginia, his colleagues grow concerned. Robert is not the sort of person to miss a day of work, let alone not tell his colleagues he isn't coming in if he ever does, so his absence immediately raises the alarm. As a widower with 3 grown children, Robert lives alone, so his colleagues ask his nearest neighbor to check in on him and make sure everything's okay. But everything isn't okay. Arriving at his remote farmhouse in Leesburg, his neighbor finds the front door has been left wide open, and as he cautiously enters, he immediately discovers Robert lying face down on the floor in a pool of blood, having been stabbed and slashed more than 30 times. Robert was a founding member of the Virginia Biotechnology Association and had spent the last 15 years making countless advancements in the fields of biometrics and DNA analysis, with his work in DNA sequencing and profiling transforming the way violent crimes were solved. Yet in a tragic turn of irony, Robert himself had just become a victim of a violent murder. When investigators arrive at the scene, there are no signs of forced entry, with the killer likely having been let in through the front door. No fingerprints are discovered, and no items appear to have been stolen, ruling robbery out as the motive. Over the recent months, a number of other high-profile scientists had been murdered or found dead under mysterious circumstances, leading the investigators to wonder if Robert's murder was part of some sort of pattern or wider conspiracy. But as they look over the body, the sheer level of brutality exhibited feels more like the work of someone with a personal, emotional connection to him, with Robert having received dozens of wounds to his back, chest, neck, and wrists. Some with so much force that the floor beneath him was penetrated by the murder weapon. Disturbingly, however, it's soon determined that the weapon used to kill him was a 2-foot-long sword. And even more chillingly, among the many wounds on his body, the investigators discover an X carved into the back of Robert's neck. Though its meaning isn't clear to them yet, the combination of the sword and the unusual marking forces them to consider that his murder was actually ritualistic in nature. But while at first it may have looked like an occult killing to them, it wouldn't be long before the truth of what happened would come to light. And it was perhaps even stranger, because Robert's true killer wasn't some mysterious cult. Instead, it was a young, mentally unstable man who believed he was a vampire, who received orders from entities that instructed him to kill, which he called Saba, Nicodemus, and Ordog. Yet it wasn't these entities who had influenced him or planted the idea of murdering Robert in his head. It was one of the people closest to Robert in the world, who had used a role-playing game to manipulate him to commit the murder. This is the story of When the investigators were able to determine Robert had likely been killed 2 days earlier on December 8th, Robert's neighbor informed them that he had seen a teenage girl and 2 boys arriving at the farmhouse that evening. Surprisingly, it turned out these 3 teenagers had called a tow truck after their car had gotten stuck in the mud outside the house, which resulted in them providing their real names and addresses. So it took no time at all to identify the 3 of them as 19-year-old Catherine Inglis, 21-year-old Michael Foale, and 18-year-old Kyle Hulbert. The 3 were immediately taken in for questioning, and upon searching their homes, the investigators found disturbing evidence that seemed to back up the idea that this was an occult murder of some sort. During their searches, they discovered books on human sacrifices, documents linking the X symbol to an occult ritual, and even an assortment of strange knives, swords, and black cloaks. So had these 3 teens really murdered Robert as part of some sort of ritual? Intriguingly, Kyle's computer seemed to point them in a slightly different direction, with conversations found that suggested the murder may have been part of some sort of strange fantasy role-playing game called Underworld. All 3 of them were close friends of Robert's youngest daughter, Clara. The detectives had already found it odd that Clara had seemed indifferent to the news of her father's death compared to her distraught siblings, but had no reason to suspect her, at least not yet. On December 12th, Clara was brought in for questioning, given her relationship with the 3 suspects. In a 5-hour interview, she told the investigators that Catherine and Michael had been her friends since high school, with Kyle having recently joined their group. When asked if she felt they might have murdered her father, Clara was adamant Catherine and Michael would never have done such a thing. Although she didn't know Kyle as well, she also told them she didn't believe he had anything to do with it. But when pushed, she did say something that caught their attention. She told them that deep down in her heart, she knew Kyle had probably done it. But it wasn't until they spoke to Catherine that they really began to understand how involved in the entire situation Clara actually was. According to Catherine's 10-page statement, she and her boyfriend Michael had gone shopping on December 8th, before giving Kyle a ride to the Schwartz farmhouse because he told them he had a job to do there. When Kyle entered the house, he was wearing a long trench coat which was concealing a sword strapped to his side. Though Kyle regularly carried swords and other weapons on him, as he was obsessed with live-action role-playing, there was something unsettling about it on this occasion. As the couple waited outside for him to return, they tried to turn their car around before getting stuck in the mud. So when Kyle came back out, they asked him to go and use the phone inside to call for assistance. But Kyle, cold and emotionless, simply told them that nobody was in the house, despite having just been inside for quite some time. Then, Catherine noticed that the trench coat he was wearing had been torn. And even more chillingly, Kyle's sword was streaked with dark red liquid that looked like blood. In her own words, she did the math and knew he had just killed Robert. According to her, Kyle had then told Clara the following day that he'd done it, long before she had been brought in to talk to the investigators. As to why Clara had not come to the police once she knew about it, Catherine claimed that Clara had actually wanted her father to be killed because, according to her, he was physically and emotionally abusing her. Catherine's statement went even further, making it clear that Clara had planned for Kyle to murder her father, with Clara allegedly having told her that Kyle's mental health issues would mean he'd take the full blame if they were ever caught. Supposedly, the four friends then conspired together to come up with an alibi. They had been in the area to pick up notebooks for Clara, but nobody had answered the door when they knocked. She claimed Clara had even called them the day her father's body was found, warning them that the police knew their names and that she had been spoken to but not arrested. Shockingly, Catherine seemed to think that she had done nothing wrong and would be able to go back to her normal life now she had told them the truth about what Kyle had done, not understanding the reality of her situation. Yet, if her story was true, she and Michael had at the very least known about the murder after it had happened, and had conspired to cover it up with the others rather than informing the police. With this statement, the investigators then spoke to Kyle, who immediately confessed to having killed Robert. Backing up Catherine's version of events, he told them that Catherine and Michael had no idea about it until it was too late, and that he was in a delusional state when he did it. As Catherine had mentioned, the investigators quickly discovered that Kyle was diagnosed with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and had a long history of mental health issues and psychiatric care linked to psychosis and other severe delusions, such as hearing voices, seeing visions, and believing he was an actual vampire. Although his confession included some very strange claims, as you can imagine, it seemed clear that Clara had led him to believe that her father was abusing and even poisoning her, which caused him to think he needed to kill him to save her. Highlighting how much these claims influenced Kyle, he told them, "I thought about killing him when the visions got out of control. I could no longer sleep without seeing him doing something to Clara." The detectives were able to recover Robert's DNA from Kyle's trench coat, as well as finding numerous messages on his computer discussing the murder, backing up his story. These included a chat conversation with Clara saved under the name UW, which would later turn out to be short for a fantasy role-playing game they called Underworld. With all of this information, the detectives turned their attention to Clara, and she was arrested at her dormitory in James Madison University in Harrisonburg, charged with murdering her father, alongside her 3 friends. Now it was down to the detectives to try and make sense of why this had truly happened, who had done what, and who was actually responsible. But to understand that, we need to understand everything that led up to the brutal murder. So you know what that means. We need to go all the way back to the start. Clara Jane Schwartz was born in Loudoun County, Virginia, in 1981, to Robert and Joan Schwartz. The youngest of 3 siblings, Clara's childhood seems to have been fairly ordinary. She did well in school and was liked by both her peers and her teachers. In high school, she expressed a love for both science and history, and was an engaged member of the school's history club. But in 1997, when Clara was 16, her mother Joan lost her battle with cancer and passed away. While the whole family struggled with the loss, Clara seemed to be particularly impacted by it, and her relationship with her father completely fell apart as a result. Her new interests, including the way she started dressing, the music she began listening to, and her growing fascination with death, the occult, and even self-harm, resulted in regular clashes with Robert. while Robert tried desperately to help her with her grief, even buying her a horse that he thought might keep her busy and occupied. His job meant that he worked long hours and was rarely present or able to provide her with the physical and emotional support she was craving. This led to Clara developing a deep-seated resentment towards him, and she began to act out, both at home and at school, where she struggled to fit in and found herself becoming increasingly isolated and ostracized. But then, she met Catherine and her boyfriend Michael, bonding with them over their shared experiences with depression and dark thoughts, as well as their interests in media and music exploring darker concepts and themes. With all three of them struggling to fit in at school, they formed a close friendship and began regularly engaging in fantasy role-playing games as a way to escape reality together. When her two older siblings moved out, Clara was left alone with Robert in their isolated farmhouse. And it was around this time that she began confiding in Catherine that her father was trying to harm her. She told Catherine that Robert was poisoning her food, that he was physically hitting her, and even mentioned that he had tried to drown her in their pool on one occasion. However, although Catherine believed her friend, she would later state that she never once actually saw an injury or any behavior from Robert to back up these claims, nor did anyone else for that matter. Whether true or not, the resentment Clara felt towards her father was clear from diary entries stating things such as, "I feel the utmost hatred for him, and I hope he rots in hell if it exists. I hope he suffers and understands how psychotic his actions have become." When telling Catherine about what Robert was allegedly doing to her, Clara also mentioned on numerous occasions that she wished he was dead because she would inherit around $250,000 when he died, which she claimed she would use to buy a house for the three of them to live in together. And unfortunately, it wouldn't be long before Clara began looking for ways to make this a reality. In the year 2000, Clara attended James Madison University to study computer science. While she once again excelled in her studies, she continued struggling to build and maintain friendships. Her interests in dark topics only seemed to intensify in this isolated situation, and she became even more obsessed with learning about satanic cults, witchcraft, and other dark and occult beliefs. Eventually, however, she did manage to join a friend group built up of outsiders with similar interests, including a guy called Patrick House. Patrick was passionate about fantasy role-playing games, making it easy for the two of them to bond, and they soon began dating. This led Clara to create her own RPG game called Underworld, which the two of them played together over Instant Messenger. In the game, Patrick took on the role of a rogue assassin, while Clara played a pagan high priestess she called Lord Chaos. The only goal of the Underworld game was to kill a character called Old Guy, who was based on Clara's father. While this initially seemed lighthearted to Patrick, it wasn't long before Clara began hinting that she actually wanted him to kill her father in real life. She began confiding in him that her father had molested her and even attempted to kill her on numerous occasions. Initially, Patrick played along with her, discussing how he would kill her father in a sort of twisted roleplay. However, this was not a joke to Clara. It wasn't roleplay. It wasn't just words. And as far as she was concerned, Patrick was actually going to do it for her. She bought Patrick a book about poisons, wanting her father's death to look as natural as possible to make sure she didn't miss out on her insurance money by it being somehow traced back to her. Then, while out for a meal with Patrick and Catherine, Clara refused to eat her steak, telling them that it had been poisoned by her father. When they queried how he could have done such a thing, she claimed he was coordinating with the chef, using it as proof that he needed to be killed as soon as possible. This all became too much for Patrick, and soon after this incident he broke up with her and cut all ties with Michael and Catherine. But this ultimately wasn't a problem for Clara, because almost immediately she met the next person she would start pressuring to kill her father for her. Only this time, her claims and her demands would be taken seriously. At a Renaissance fair in Maryland, Clara met 18-year-old Kyle Hulbert, and he quickly bonded with her over their shared love of role-playing, fantasy, and the occult, leading him to become the fourth member of her little friend group. According to Kyle, Clara almost immediately became his closest friend, who he loved like a sister, feeling especially connected to her because she told him she also struggled with schizophrenia. Though as with most of the claims Clara made, there is no evidence to back this up, and it seems more than likely she was lying as part of an orchestrated plan to manipulate him. Kyle was particularly fond of live-action role-playing, and was obsessed with magic and medieval weaponry, such as swords. But Kyle's engagement with role-playing was a little darker and more serious than most. Because Kyle had a long history of mental health issues, including being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, and had spent most of his life in and out of psychiatric institutions. He had been taken into the state's care at age 6, and had been institutionalized 7 times in the 12 years since then, spending his entire life bouncing between psychiatric wards and foster homes. Having just gotten out of hospital a couple of months before meeting Clara, Kyle was released from the state's care due to now being a legal adult, and had immediately started using drugs and alcohol. As a result of his mental illnesses, Kyle was prone to suffering from psychosis and hallucinations, and struggled to understand what was real and what wasn't. While most people who participate in live-action roleplay are well aware they are pretending and performing, Kyle was not. These groups actually helped reinforce and confirm his delusions, and he found it difficult to distinguish between what was reality and what was roleplay. As a result, Kyle began to believe that he was an actual vampire. He even believed that the voices he heard in his head, which he called Saba, Nicodemus, and Ordog, gave him instructions as to who he could and who he couldn't kill as a vampire. According to him, these entities only allowed him to kill when it served what he called a just cause. As they became fast friends, Clara introduced her own RPG game, Underworld, to Kyle, indulging his belief that he was a vampire by playing along with it. In turn, she continued playing out her role as Lord Chaos, the pagan high priestess, using her father as the antagonist in their game. But given Kyle's inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, it didn't take much for Clara to convince him that her actual father was abusing her both physically and emotionally in real life, and that only he was capable of rescuing her from him. In Kyle, Clara had found the perfect person to manipulate into carrying out her wishes. She even told Catherine that she was certain she would be able to convince him to do it for her. And this theory was proven true during one of their underworld conversations about her father's abuse, when Kyle asked her for permission to kill him for her. Clara, responding calmly, simply told him they would talk about it in person. On the handful of occasions when Kyle visited Clara's house and met Robert in person, she continued feeding him lies about how he was trying to kill her. With everything she had told him, Kyle was convinced that he could sense hostility and violence in Robert's aura, and that it was all true. On one occasion, Kyle had arrived at the house with his sharpened sword at his side, and Clara chose this moment to tell him that her father had poisoned the pork chop that he'd cooked for her, claiming she had seen him tamper with it. Taking a bite, Kyle immediately spat it out, convinced that she was right. Even though he barely knew her, Kyle believed that it was his duty to protect her. He struggled with visions and hallucinations in which Robert was harming her, becoming obsessed with the idea. And this all gave the entities in his head the just cause they needed to allow him to kill. Throughout November, Clara began plotting the murder with him in their online underworld chats, trying to ensure that whatever he did could not be traced back to her. Though clearly deleting the conversations from her dorm room computer never occurred to her, because everything she said was saved on it when the police later retrieved it. Ensuring that Kyle would act upon her request sooner rather than later, Clara then claimed that she was set to go on a Christmas trip to the Virgin Islands with her father, which she knew she would never return from. Having already stopped taking his medication, the visions of Robert harming Clara became all-consuming to Kyle. He felt compelled to stop him before he killed her, leading him to ask the entities in his head if he had permission to do it. According to him, they agreed he had just cause to die, and granted him the permission he needed to act upon it. So he arrived at the farmhouse on December 8th, with his sword hidden beneath his trench coat, ready to take Robert's life. And it's hard to claim Clara didn't know what he was planning to do that night, because she had actually given him money for gas and supplies the night before to do it, including gloves and a do-rag to avoid leaving fingerprints and hairs at the scene, and a phone card so he could call her after in a way that couldn't be traced. That night, according to his own 7-page confession, Kyle knocked on the door, asking if Clara was home when Robert answered. When he told her that she wasn't, he asked for her phone number. So Robert invited him inside as he retrieved it. After using the bathroom, Kyle re-emerged and confronted Robert, accusing him of abusing his daughter. According to Kyle, even though Robert denied the accusations, he could see the guilt in his eyes and knew that it was all true. Kyle then claimed that Robert smiled at him, before suddenly striking him across the face, resulting in a cut just above his left eye. So Kyle drew his sword and slashed Robert, causing him to drop to his knees. Robert tried to fight back and to grab the blade, but Kyle continued slashing. When some of Robert's blood then splashed into his mouth, Kyle claimed he was driven into a vampiric frenzy, causing him to lose control and begin to hack, slash and stab him over and over again. Lying on the floor, Robert supposedly then looked up at him and asked, "What did I ever do to you?" before he delivered the fatal blow. With Robert dead, Kyle claims he regained his sanity and pulled the sword from his back, rinsing it off before he turned off all the lights. One of the entities in his head then told him that Robert's soul had left his body and he needed to flee immediately. The next day, he called Clara to tell her that he had killed her father, just as they had planned together. Initially, there was debate over how admissible Kyle's confession would be because of his history of mental illness. But given his statement aligned with what was found on Clara's computer, as well as the statements made by Catherine and Michael, it was ultimately allowed to be used as evidence. The prosecution even managed to track down Patrick, who revealed all the details about how Clara had previously tried to recruit him to kill her father months earlier. As a result, Clara was charged with first-degree murder, solicitation to commit murder, and 2 charges of conspiracy to commit murder for her conversations with both Kyle and Patrick. Kyle and Michael were also both charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, while Catherine was instead given a plea deal that meant she would only be charged as an accessory after the fact in exchange for her testimony, with the prosecution viewing her as the least culpable. Before her trial, nearly all of Clara's relatives, including her brother, sister, and extended family, signed a letter urging the judge to keep her in jail until the trial, expressing concerns that she posed a danger to herself and to them if she was released. With her trial beginning in October 2002, prosecutor Jennifer Wexton laid out a simple and detailed account of everything that had happened. Patrick testified that Clara had tried to transition his fictional role as an assassin from their fantasy underworld game into real life, and that he broke up with her and cut ties with her friends when he realized that she was serious about wanting him to kill her father. He also explained that she had told him she would secure a large inheritance if her father were to die. Kyle was also called to testify but refused, invoking his right against self-incrimination. But regardless, as his written confession had been allowed to be used as evidence, it was read out in full for the jury to hear. Alongside the various underworld chat logs, including discussions of killing her father, the prosecution also presented a note written by Clara that was found in her dorm room. Although it was coded, like much of the chat, Wexton claimed it said, "Thanks guys for killing my dad." In her defense, Clara's attorneys tried to claim that the chats were nothing but fantasy and venting from Clara, and that she had believed that Kyle was just joking about killing her real father. According to them, Clara was just a naive girl whose words were twisted by troubled individuals looking for meaning in fantasy. This led to them attempting to undermine the credibility of both Kyle and Patrick, painting them both as unstable individuals who could not be trusted and had simply misinterpreted things. They used Kyle's history of mental illness to claim that he had mistaken fantasy for reality. And they used their cross-examination of Patrick to get him to talk about some of his unusual beliefs, such as the idea that dragons once really existed, to try and make the jury question his character. However, undermining all of their claims was the testimony of Clara's best friend, Catherine. Catherine made it clear that Clara had regularly expressed her desire to kill her father in real life, and had even told her she believed she could convince Kyle to do it. Catherine's testimony was so damning that it left only 2 options. Either she was lying through her teeth, or Clara had been trying to get someone to kill her father for months. On October 15th, after just 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Clara guilty on all charges, with the jury recommending she receive a 48-year prison sentence, dismissing claims for leniency from her defense due to her father's supposed abuse. It's worth noting, both of her siblings and all of her family members adamantly denied her claims about Robert, and beyond her own words, no evidence was ever found to back them up. At the sentencing hearing, her sister Michelle stated, "It's been nothing but a nightmare since the first day I found out. It's hard enough it was my father, but on top of that to have my sister committing such a horrible crime." Despite attempts from her defense to reduce her sentence, Judge Thomas Horn ultimately agreed with the jury and upheld their decision. When asked if she had anything to say about the proceedings, Clara coldly responded with, "Nothing that hasn't already been said." So he sentenced her to the recommended 48 years behind bars, with Clara showing no reaction at all as she was led from the courtroom. On December 20th, Michael pled guilty to second-degree murder. In his statement, he admitted he had known what Kyle was planning to do, and that even though he had wanted nothing to do with it, he had still driven him to the farmhouse that night. He claimed he had tried to justify Kyle's actions as he knew he believed he was saving Clara. As a result of his involvement, he was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The actual murderer, Kyle, was expected to pursue an insanity defense. However, given there was so much proof that the murder was premeditated, it was deemed unlikely to succeed, and his attorneys ultimately chose not to go down that route. On March 10, 2003, a week before his trial was scheduled to begin, Kyle instead chose to plead guilty. In his statement, he expressed regret for his choices, having come to realize that Clara had manipulated and used him, saying he wished he'd never met her. According to his attorneys, Clara was the puppet master, and he was merely the puppet. At his sentencing, a number of psychiatrists testified about Kyle's various delusions and mental illnesses, painting him as a damaged individual who had believed he was protecting Clara by killing her father. While Judge Horn acknowledged his difficult past and struggles, he ultimately told him it did not absolve him of guilt, stating, "This is not a fantasy world for the Schwartz family. It's real. Every day they live with the death of Robert, a child, a father, and the fact that he left this world at your hands and at the hands of his own daughter." He then sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for the conspiracy charges. And finally, it was time for Catherine's sentencing. However, having taken a plea deal meaning she couldn't be charged with first-degree murder, and since the others chose not to testify against her to avoid further implicating themselves, the evidence against her was limited. On November 14, 2003, she was sentenced to 12 months in jail for her role as an accessory after the fact. Though due to time served, this meant she was released 6 days later. As of 2025, Clara remains incarcerated at the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women in Virginia, while Kyle is still serving his life sentence at the River North Correctional Center. Ultimately, whether any of Clara's claims about her father's abuse were true or not is unknown. While she did spend a year living alone with him, and not all abuse is easily provable, it's clear from everything else that happened that Clara was a compulsive liar. There is no question that she conspired to have her father killed, yet she continually tried to pin the blame on everyone else around her and deny responsibility. She tried to weaponize Kyle's mental instability to put the blame solely on him, despite clearly having manipulated him into carrying out the murder in the first place. Given Patrick and Catherine both testified that Clara had spoken multiple times about getting a large inheritance payout upon the death of her father, it seems more likely that money was the motive for her wanting him to be killed. While Kyle is of course responsible for his own actions, and he made the choice to kill Robert on behalf of Clara, it's hard not to feel some degree of sympathy towards him. He was clearly a very damaged and vulnerable individual, who Clara had no issue taking advantage of. That said, given how unstable Kyle clearly was, and how delusional he was, I find it hard to imagine that he would not have harmed someone else eventually, even if he had never met Clara. His inability to distinguish between reality and fantasy, combined with his obsession with weapons, violence, and the occult, feels like it inevitably would have led to something dark and sinister occurring. And with that, our deep dive into this unusual case comes to a close. Let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. This case was entirely new to me before I began researching it, so if it was one you were already familiar with, let me know if I missed anything in my coverage down below. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe, and consider checking out some of my other true crime deep dives up on the channel. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.